Good afternoon. My name is Josefine Pettersson. I'm the Technical Officer at Australian Organic Ltd, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome you here today. As part of our program, I will be starting us off as we wait for more people to come online. This is the first of the Viticulture and Climate Change Series today, but if you look forward, we do also have this for all other major organic industries coming up. So the next one is in 2 months' time, and that will be horticulture. So you'll soon be able to sign up to that if that is of interest. But otherwise, I do hope that you enjoy the program that we have today. So anytime, please introduce yourselves. You can type in questions anytime. A recording of the presentation and slides are going to be shared at the end, most probably emailed to you tomorrow. Here in the organic industry, sustainability is core, and it's only really through understanding the emissions that we can understand also how we can mitigate it, and understanding climate change in terms of how we as an industry can improve our resilience towards the changes that are potentially coming. So we have some amazing speakers here for you today. First off, we have Vanya Cullen. She's the Managing Director and Chief Winemaker at Cullen Wines. 2020 James Halliday Winemaker of the Year. In terms of the environmental aspects, though, that's what's really impressive. She has seen a 1.5% increase in soil organic matter over the last 5 years. She became Australia's first carbon positive winery, not just carbon neutral, but carbon positive, and she's located in Margaret River, Western Australia. We also have Hayley Purbrick. So she's a 5th generation Purbrick family owner. She's the previous Chief Environmental Officer at Tarbilk Wines. They have, over 160 hectares of native revegetation around the winery. Since 2013, they've reduced emissions by 45%. They're a carbon neutral winery, and they're located in the Ngambie Lakes region of central Victoria. And last but definitely not least, we have Richard Leask. So he is not a certified organic grower at this point in time, but we're working on changing that. So Richard did his 2019 Nuffield Scholar on sustainability. Is being sustainable enough for wine? And he did a deep dive into the soil microbial health and regenerative agriculture within vineyards. So at this point in time, he's 100% carbon offset, and he joins us from McLaren Vale, South Australia. So thank you again for joining us here today, and hopefully we can have some good discussion. Just as a recap, as we're waiting for more people to come online, the climate change situation in Australia, from the introductory episode that we had last month, annually, climate change already is costing $30,000 per producer annually. And this was before the flooding that we had all along the East Coast. So I'm very sure with inflation and flooding that has already increased. If we even think back to 2 years ago, the Black Summer bushfires, they were the worst in Australia's recorded history. The equivalent area to the country of the United Kingdom burnt in one season here in Australia. And already here in Australia, we have seen a 1.5 degree increase in temperature, and this is above the global average for the same period. So with all these challenges, what does this mean for organic viticulture? If we go back to Dr. Mark Howden, he presented in terms of what this means for the temperature trajectories. You can see on the right-hand side here, we've got the Paris Agreement goals, the current trajectory, and 4 degrees is pretty much the increase that we are going to have unless we as a country, as a nation, as the people of this planet don't change things. And that comes down to the everyday decisions that you make as a consumer, but also as a producer, the ways that you choose to farm. So If we, the last slides that were quite impressive from Dr. Howden's presentation was that, warmer temperatures and less rain was predicted. So you can see in terms of a 4-degree global warming, that will actually correspond more to between 5 and 6 degrees global warming here in Australia. But the most alarming thing rather is, the decreased amount of rain that we're going to have, and that's especially for Western Australia. So, Vanya, as the East Coast has been flooding, Western Australia has been in the news for other reasons. Perth recorded its hottest day on record, hitting 50.7 degrees in Onslow. The bushfire season is longer every year. What have you been doing as a winery to mitigate this? Sorry, you're just on mute, Vanya. You're just going to have to unmute.
Too. Apologies. As a winery, we've had a long-term strategy with respect to sustainability and, of course, climate change. Being a certified biodynamic and also now carbon positive. In 2007, we became carbon neutral through offsetting our emissions by planting trees in the Yarra Yarra Biodiversity Corridor. This has been, I suppose, it's been quite a journey. It's cost us about $25,000 a year over that time. In 2009, we started measuring the soil carbon, and from 2009 to 2014, we found that our soil carbon increased by 1.9%. That's sort of 70. I think we were sequestering 79.5 tonnes per hectare of carbon dioxide, and also holding that in the soil. This is a big difference with respect to conventional farms, where soil carbon is more difficult to keep stable because of the the biodiversity of the crops that we have, and also the cover crops that they're not perennials, they're annuals, so they do stay there. So we're not losing that soil carbon, and to get that outcome where we, I think through our soil carbon, holding that soil carbon, we have become the first certified carbon negative winery, where our soils are sequestering and holding more carbon than our whole business emits by quite some quantity. It's been like 9,000 tonnes over that time, around 1,800 tonnes a year. So it's been quite an incredible way to mitigate climate change. I know they talk about trees being more important to plant and a better way to look at mitigating it, but I actually believe that in terms of total land care and custodianship and long-term sustainability, that soil carbon is a really important direction, because it also looks after the land as organic and biodynamic properties do.
Yeah, definitely. And have you already started seeing these temperature increases affecting your vines?
Look, I think it was an interesting summer. It's been a different sort of where my feeling is that the climate is very unstable almost. We had, of course, Perth had 50.7. We had a heat wave over the Christmas period. It was interesting that we didn't actually get any. We got some sunburnt leaves, but we didn't actually get any sunburnt fruit, unlike other people. And so the skins of the berries weren't sunburnt. So we didn't suffer any damage at all, really, from that heat wave. What that's due to, we don't know. We haven't got the resources to analyse everything, but it was, I think, because the vines were very healthy. And now we're looking at the break of the season's looking like it's about to come this weekend, I think. But we've got 6 or 7 days of rain forecast. But it's been a very varied season, one of the most unusual I remember, with really good rains last year, high water tables, then the heat wave, And so, yeah, it's really hard to know. But yeah, the forecast for the southwest are, you know, there's a lot of red areas there. And I feel that we can act now and change things. And there's a lot of talk and a lot of confusion about what we should do. And I don't see it as confusing at all. We just need to act now and stop having, you know what I mean? It's like things can be done. And this is what's happened on our tiny little speck of sand in Williabra Margaret River is an example of what can be done in terms of reversing those climate emissions, We're also a part of the International Wineries for Climate Action, which I think a few other places in Australia are joining now, which is a global group run by Torres family and the Jackson family, and they have joined up to you know, the United Nations Race to Zero. So there's been a lot of things happening with respect to us, and I think it's probably, you know, the climate change crisis is the existential crisis that affects everybody. So we're all involved and should be heavily committed to acting upon it now. And I think, you know, the use of synthetic fertilizers and chemicals on the land, it's a different approach, and the whole thing of carbon farming has become about making money, which is, I suppose, an incentive, but it also needs to really be importantly looking after the land.
Definitely. So, I mean, if we look at the Australian wine industry at this point in time, you know, over $2 billion dollars worth of wine is exported annually, and the organic and biodynamic wine is just a very small part of that. However, you know, this isn't something to be disheartened by, as organic and biodynamic wine represents 22% plus of market share in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. So, I mean, it is still a niche industry with exports just under 0.5% of bottled exports, but I think as we progress, it will be really interesting to see how this changes. So
one of the changes that needs to happen is legislation on the use of the words organic and biodynamic, because there's a lot of greenwashing out there, and you know, to have authenticity with respect to both within Australia and, you know, consumers buying that, and also you know, when we export overseas, we have to have proof of our certified organic. So I think that's one thing that really needs to change before certainly things like, you know, I don't know, the tasting for climate change, which is a wonderful global group also that influences sommeliers to buy organic or biodynamic or you know, climate I suppose wines that are taking in climate change in their wine growing decisions. So yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just thought I should say that.
Oh no, we're definitely working on that, and we're entering into the, you know, the final stages of the RIS at the moment, and now everything has been put on hold, I understand, due to the election, but that is definitely a space to watch. Either way, Wine Australia, so they did a life cycle assessment of emissions from the wine sector, and Hayley, I understand that, you know, this is a very small emissions compared to, you know, what was estimated for you when you did that life cycle emissions calculations, and what has your experience been with trying to then reduce that?
Yeah, I think just touching on the data, so this data draws on information from Entwine, which is, I guess, the Australian wine industry sustainability program that they're running. And so the type of data that goes into this footprint is very high level, in my experience, compared to the carbon auditing that we do for To Bilk. So taking on point what Vanya has brought forward, I think for us, because we do export our wine, we go through a pretty thorough carbon auditing process. So there's 3 carbon auditing standards in Australia, globally. So there's the international standards, the NCOS, which is the Australian standards, and the PAS, which is the European standards. And so we use an external agency to audit us at an organisation and a product level across scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So the figure there on 1.16 kilos, per litre, that to me strikes me as very, very low compared to the average winery. So I would say it's a lot closer to 3 kilos per bottle of wine. So the way I usually describe that to customers is that for most wine businesses, if they're not focusing on sustainability and environment in their business, you can think about a 3 litre jug of milk, and that every time you drink an average bottle of wine, that's how much carbon's going up into the atmosphere each time you drink it. So for us, we've been working really hard to get that footprint down. So we've reduced our footprint by 45% over the last, I'd say we've been working in this space for over a decade, but probably in the last 6 years, we've found a lot more movement in our footprint itself. So we've put a lot more energy into reducing it. So we started around this, just over the 3 kilos per bottle, and we're down to around 2 kilos per bottle, and that's taking into account all scopes. So that's growing it in the ground, so all your inputs, it's making it, so the winemaking process and bottling, and it's also selling it to customer. So it's how you get it to your customer, be it your cellar door, direct to consumer, export, wholesale and domestic. So I think the greatest challenge with talking about carbon from an industry perspective is we don't have just one accreditation at the moment that captures all and probably gives us an accurate indication of exactly what's going on. So I would just say on this slide, to me, it probably undersells the amount of carbon that the industry is actually producing each year.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, as you can see, majority of that is transport and glass, which, there are some huge differences here depending on how it is packaged. Is that also something that you have been experimenting with?
Yeah, I don't know, Richard, if you wanted to jump, did you want to make a comment before I jump in and answer that?
Hayley, I agree with you totally, Hayley. I mean, obviously, ours is a life cycle audit as well, from growing into the consumer's hands, and we're lucky we're a size that's a bit smaller, so we're at 1.5 now, but down from probably 2, just over 2 when we started 3 years ago. So I agree with you totally. I think that number undersells that emissions ratio, and definitely. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword for us in terms of what we use with this data. Obviously, it affects, it gives us something that we can then offset, which is clear. We need to know so we can do something about it. But it also, as we're about to discuss, becomes a management tool to then look at where our pinch points are and saying, okay, where can we do that now? For us, for this year, the reduction from about 2 kilos to just under, just around 1.5 per bottle has been around packaging. A lot of it is around packaging. And of course, a lot of it's about we haven't sold a bottle of wine overseas for 12 months. So that helps. That's another problem in itself. But that is obviously, we're going to touch on that later in the discussion about how and where we sell product is going to come into the discussion as well. So I agree with you, Hayley. That was all I wanted to add. That you're definitely on the right track there.
Yeah, I think we've done a little bit of experimenting with packaging, mainly with aluminium cans, and I guess with glass, what comes into your footprint is it takes such a large amount of energy to turn glass into a bottle, and we don't have the research at the moment, say with lighter glass technology. The shatterability is still very high, so they're really struggling to bring in recycled glass back into the bottle making process and do that in an efficient way. So we have been looking at some alternative packages. An aluminium can is a great one, because apart from the fact that the challenge that the Australian wine industry has with glass is that we don't have, we've got an oversupply of glass to recycle at the moment. We cannot recycle it quick enough. So we've got a bit of a waste issue at the end of the chain. As compared to aluminium, I think it's something like 92% of all aluminium containers that get produced get recycled, which is incredibly high for a piece of waste material. So we looked at aluminium cans. Some of the challenges that we had was with the reactivity of the actual package with the wine. So high acid can create a negative reaction within the product itself, making it unconsumable. So that is a challenge. The package itself, it's got a 9-month shelf life. So if you're a wine producer and you want to just do a small run rather than a bigger run, you know, there's a lot of risk in there. There's not a lot of canneries in Australia doing wine production in the can as well, particularly at low quantities. So that's a bit tricky. And then there's also customer expectation around what they expect when they open an aluminium can product, which is they expect it to be fresh, light, crisp, and a little bit of bubble is what they're used to expecting. So we've found it really challenging to get our style of wine into that type of container. The only other package we've looked at is there's a package from the UK that is sort of like a zhuzhed up cask where it's got a plastic liner that looks like a wine bottle. It's got like a cardboard external and a bladder liner internal. Again, the challenge we've got in Australia is we cannot recycle those bladder linings. They can in the UK, so it's a bit different. So it doesn't necessarily meet what consumers are looking for in those products. Is more of a zero waste concept. So we didn't go down that path of doing the sort of cask equivalent just because it wasn't fully recyclable. Whereas with a wine bottle, albeit we can't recycle glass fast enough, everything is recyclable outside of some of the linings of the aluminium cap, and also some of the linings that you have on your labels as well can be prohibitive. So yeah.
We've managed to, the latest bottles we're using now are local again, and the bottle manufacturer in South Australia, the large ones, working really hard on the waste stream that Hayley's talking about. They realise that we need to repurpose a lot more. So we've got the current bottles are about 30% to 35% recycled glass that we're now using, and they're at the just sub 500 gram sort of mark. 330 is great. I agree with Hayley. I don't know about everyone else, but we get enough breakages as it is when we're sending stuff at the moment. So that is going to be a challenge about how we make that strong enough. We've also moved back towards cork for some of our products because obviously there's some offset that's already built into that product, being natural, being the fact that most of it's coming from forests that are well managed and well grown and old. Even with the transport, it's better than the aluminium because there's just so much energy required to then turn that into something else. Not only is it energy intensive at the start, it's energy intensive at the end. So it almost seems like a never-ending doom loop for a while when you get onto this stuff. But I think the more we talk about it, and the solutions will come, whether they come really quickly or a bit slowly, will be happening. But we can even see in our experience, 18 months is a long time, and it won't be long before we take a consumer who's younger, especially for our products, on a journey that 4 litre, 3 litre, 2 litre casks aren't going to be seen as a problem, but actually seen as a really useful way of having a nice product that's environmentally friendly.
Yeah, I think it was incredible to see that lightweight glass just wasn't, let alone recycled, but lightweight glass wasn't available in Australia, and then all of a sudden it was everywhere, which was great, because that's as you say, the glass is a and the freight are the two major contributors to the emissions. But it's I think anything's possible, and I really am. I suppose I'm really focused on land care, and I think this is everyone's. We must reduce our emissions. That's something that's really important. But I also think in turning the whole, the carbon discussion around and the climate change discussion around, we really need to act as cultural custodians. And I believe there's some sort of program for Wine Australia to map out how everyone can become carbon neutral, and how about, we've seen the climate change modelling. So I think it's like, how do we, I've always had this thing which I've wondered about whenever we get talking about climate change, we're talking about, you know, the electric car and the, you know, the bottles and all of those things which are important. But I feel the most important part of it, and, you know, it is how do we look after the land so the land is sustainable and we can sequester and hold that carbon in the soil as it should be if the land was looked after properly. And I really believe that, you know, organic and biodynamic or, you know, land care, which has that in mind, will produce the answers, and the other things will follow. And you know, we're also, you know, we have you know, predominantly solar powered, and we link into the grid, and, you know, that's sort of is something we can do for most of the year apart from harvest, when our you know, our usage is just too high. But I think all of those things, like the biodiversity, you know, monoculture isn't good for climate change, because, you know, the grass all, you know, it all dies off, and then you get the loss of the carbon dioxide from the soil. So the whole biodiversity, you know, and understanding of how nature works, of having, you know, deep rooted plants that can, you know, improve the soil structure and the compost. It's just it's a really very complex sort of discussion about how we look after the land and how we act as, you know, land care custodians, as well as reduce those emissions. And the question of, you know, how did we, the actual turning into carbon positive took carbon neutral in Western Australia. It took us 6 months for them to actually do that certification, and it was part of our auditing process in that sense, but they'd never done it before. So it was something we weren't sure was going to be able to be done. But our vineyard was looked at as being carbon neutral in terms of how it operated, but we just felt, well, with all of our, you know, our biodiversity of our, you know, 23 plant species mid-rows, and the fact that we weren't tilling the soil after, you know, after we slashed rather than tilling until we sowed the cover crop in, it really, we felt that there was a different sort of way of looking at that. So, you know, all the aspects, and you know, you can't do everything at once. You can only just do as much as you can. And I think that intention and that slowly moving towards a place, like you say, everyone's in a different part of the journey. We've been on it for a long while, but you really have to do it yourself and work it out yourself. That's the other thing. You know, people always ask us, how do you make a compost pile? Well, it's like, you actually go and make the compost pile. We can, you know, you can read a book or whatever, but you have to do it. And I think all of these things with respect to climate change, people have to do them, and to sort of act now. Yeah, it's those, the you know, what sort of packaging we'll be using. You know, there's all sorts of alternatives coming onto the market now, but yeah, I guess it's just, we need to speed up the discussion about, you know, particularly in Australia, I think, in terms of sustainability and actual doing things.
Plastics is a huge part of the organic industry, especially for fresh fruit and vegetables. And so, you know, we will be having workshops on this going forward, as it's not just bottling wine where this is important. It's through all facets of organic production. And so if we look at some of the other potential increases with the warmer temperatures, you know, the chance of bushfires are going to increase by 15 to 70% in Australia with this. And I mean, now you can do tests to look for biomarkers through Wine Australia. Is this something that any of you have had experience with? Have you had crops destroyed due to bushfires before?
We haven't, no. We haven't had bushfires cause any damage. We did have a little bit of smoke drifting in on Friday, but that was from Donnelly River, and the research has shown that if the smoke's in the air for an hour, then the smoke taint doesn't exist. But certainly the load in the bush at the moment is very high, and we've had a lot of bushfires everywhere, but fortunately we haven't had any effects for that ever, so we're lucky.
Well, that's very positive, and hopefully it stays that way. So I guess warmer temperatures, also what is predicted is increased pest and disease. And Richard, I understand that you monitor the Brix levels within your plants religiously to make sure that regardless of this, that won't be an issue. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, Josefine, that's just part of the sort of, trying to understand what is a very complex system, when we're dealing with these, more naturally run enterprises. So we're trying to, we're obviously wanting to understand, what complex sugars and high brix levels in plant sap potentially can give us in terms of pest and disease control. It's still early days for us in terms of understanding it fully, but the more we're using, these complex compost teas and compost in the system, we're finding that the brix levels are higher. It doesn't make us disease free, and we've still got similar pressures potentially to, the region that we're in. I mean, this year was a good example. Powdery mildew and downy mildew were quite strong and prevalent, but what we need to control them is obviously much softer. And you and I have had a discussion around the fact that, essentially we're running an organic spray program because we think that our vine health is strong enough to deal with it, and it is. The end goal is to hopefully not do anything would be great. And that obviously that plays into the whole, our footprint on our producing a product. But we need to understand more about how plants relate to their surroundings before we can just go holus bolus. And we're playing around with biological cultures and a few other things to see whether we've got some other options up our sleeve. And again, this is an area that's moving really quickly and really quite exciting, I think, down the track. But yeah, it's the same principle as humans, really. If we can make our vineyard system and they're in the vines that are in it as healthy as possible, where they're going to give them the best chance at being disease resistant, if that's the right term, or at least not being being more resilient to the surrounding climate. So we're working on it. Like most things, there's a lot of stuff that we don't understand, but we're trying to measure some things so we can at least get some correlation down the track.
I just want to add, because I think it's so interesting what you're saying, Richard. One of the things that we've really struggled with is just having skilled people on the ground. I mean, we're at sort of a mid-sized winery and vineyard operation, so we have quite a large team, and we are noticing there's a lack of skills in this space around viti and soil health and environment sustainability. Just on the whole, that is making it really challenging for us. We really need people out there on the ground who know what they're seeing and know what they want to do with it as well. There seems to be a big focus out of universities and a lot of the research areas around how we can use modern technologies to enhance or help vineyards to be better and do better for the environment and manage their land better. What we're noticing, though, is if you don't have good skills, you can't interpret that information, and you still need someone who can see what's going on. So I feel like that's a big industry challenge for us to overcome, is how we attract people into the industry, particularly into that land and resource management side of working, so that we can get those skilled people on the ground who can support the research that Richard's talking about. Because getting out there and collating the data and getting the information, I think it's a big workload for any business to take on. You really have to be quite passionate to be out there doing that every day.
Yep, I agree, Hayley. We're not very good at it. We're very busy running our businesses and trying to do that right. And I've got a lot of things I'd like to be measuring more, and I don't have a science analytical background. I'm curious and I like to see what things are going on. But I think this is where partnerships between citizen scientists, if you like myself, and the higher education centres are going to be imperative, because we need to put some framework around what people like myself are doing and what Vanya's doing over a number of years, and seeing if we can quantify what probably she and I and you see in our vineyards, and we understand when we're seeing change and positive change. But of course, most people are driven by data sets and want to know that if they do X, they'll get Y. And at the moment, we don't have that to give people comfort, I think, in a lot of respects. So some of that's going to come with partnerships, and I'm seeing a little bit of that, because I've been open about allowing people just to come in. You come and set up a project on my vineyard, that's fine. I'm happy to do that because I don't have the time to invest in that at the moment, like you're saying, Hayley. So I think that's a work in progress, and there'll be more of that happen because it needs to. And I think it's such an important space. And that comes back to exactly what Vanya is saying, is at the end of the day, the really big driver for changing climate will be the way we manage land and landscapes. The other stuff will be spin-offs that we will be able to do along the way. But unless we get the land management right, then nothing's really going to change.
One of the interesting things we've noted is that we have the South African garden weevil, which is one of our biggest pests, and that if you can get the bricks up to 12 in the leaf, you don't get, the vines are healthy, right? So you don't get the the weevils move in, and so they're doing their job. They move in on the weaker areas and the weaker vines. So if you have the healthy vines, then you don't have as great an influence. That's one of the things we've noticed, that with the I always, which I haven't done, is like to acknowledge the Wodandi people, the traditional custodians of the land where our vineyard is as well, with respect, elders past, present and emerging. And they really have they've been doing all these fire training workshops with the Augusta Margaret River Shire as to burning in autumn, so that what happens, and it was exactly what happened with this fire that came over from Donny River that fortunately didn't affect our grapes because it was so far away, but the actual, it was a full moon and there was just so much dew that the smoke actually settled on the ground. So the carbon actually goes back into the ground, you don't lose it. And so what they do is their burning off is in autumn with mosaic burning, so it's a cool burn, so you don't lose the carbon, you don't have the effect of the bushfires. But what's been happening with Deep Bird is that all these people have contracts to go and have this number of fires burnt, so they just burn them. They've been burning all through summer, and it's just completely crazy because you get bushfires, B, you get a lot more hotter burns, so you get more smoke and more effect on the environment. So that really has to change, and that needs to come at a government level. And so it's just, I think there's a lot we can learn from Indigenous cultures with respect to sustainable land care, because I always say we've been doing 50 years of sustainable land care, but they were doing before we got there 65,000 years of looking after the land. And I think with respect to fire management, it's probably the same over where you guys are, that we just need to really change. We need to make the change, which is to burn off in autumn, not in spring and summer. In springtime and summer, springtime particularly, you lose all the wildflower seeds and burn all the animals and things. With their cool burns, you don't have any of that happening. So that's quite a sort of exciting thing that we could actually change and start doing that if people are willing, and if government departments are willing to do that. So I think there's a lot of things with respect to land care that we could learn from Indigenous peoples, and but it is, and thanks for acknowledging that, because I was somewhere the other night where people was, they were talking about carbon and carbon pricing, and it's become like it's how do we make money from the land, so how do we fertilize and make the same amount of crop and everything we're doing, but we still can and I thought, no, it's not the whole point of it. The whole point is a holistic way of looking after the world, and learning from each other. Yeah, I think it can be done. That's the big lesson. It's not that you can't do it. And more people, it's great to see more and more people going organic and biodynamic and becoming aware. And there's that. I never thought I'd live through that tipping point in my lifetime, having gone biodynamic and being treated in a very hostile manner by a lot of people in the wine industry. Is all shifted now. It's changing. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it's changing. That's a really great thing to see. So hopefully, we can, get to that tipping point where we have more and more people, that it is, a majority of people that we can all learn from, and have that sort of is a dream, to have, the whole of Australia with no synthetic chemicals on it. Wouldn't that be amazing? But anyway, that's a bit of my rave for that time. Anyway,
I think that it's really interesting.
I went right off topic, I think, as usual. Never mind.
Culturally, I think it's really interesting how the world's changing. I think you always see shifts as generations evolve and adapt, and you've got early adopters who are very progressive in their own within their community, and then it becomes sort of culturally normal. I know for me, as someone who's, well, I'm 38, and I still think that for my generation, we're still halfway there. Profit's probably the most important, then people, then environment. Well, I think we forget that environment and people have to work in synergy to actually create profit, and that's how the world works, but that's not how we always tell the story in the community. So it is quite a difficult one to shift, and it probably all starts from, you know, just the grassroots of how we communicate and talk about the environment, shifting that story and that dialogue. I think, you know, the organics industry, the wine industry, we all have a role to play in how we shift community attitudes in that space, because it will take a collective, collective ownership of telling the story in a different way if we want to see change.
Yeah, definitely. And I think wine is a product where people definitely want to listen to that story. You know, you got people going to the supermarket who will buy an apple but won't really necessarily want to hear the story of the apple. But, you know, you as winemakers, and you're so good at telling that story and educating the public regarding these things. Richard?
You're right. Even further from that, we have a unique opportunity that we have a direct link to consumer, and a lot of agricultural products do not have that. So we are uniquely placed to be able to tell a direct story and help educate people on sustainable, holistic land management and how we go about it. So I think we have a really, not only for our own industry but for agriculture in general, because there's a lot of people. I mean, I saw a lot in my Nuffield travels that there's a lot of industries doing a really good job of this, but they just do not have a link back to the consumer to be able to fully tell their story properly. So the industry is delicately placed to be a spokesperson for responsible land management.
And I mean, Richard, you looked at cover crops a lot within your Nuffield scholarship. In terms of, is there a perfect cover crop for vineyards? You know, what should you be aiming for? How does this play into, you know, preventing them competing with the vines? What was your experience there?
Well, there's nothing perfect, because every site's different, but covering the country with living plant material is goal number one. Now, if it's only one plant species, that's better than nothing. So let's not get too, you know, there's a romance and there's a little bit of a competition at the moment with more is more. You know, if I've got 20, that's great. Can I grow 40? I think we just need to make sure that we've got 100% of the land covered 100% of the time. So let's start with that as a goal. Obviously, you need to look at what's happening in your local area, what's growing well, what doesn't grow well. There's no point trying to put in a whole heap of things that are not climatically suited to your site. Work to your strengths, work on those, and try and have as diverse mix as possible. So work through the species mixes, grasses, legumes, brassicas, as Vanya said, deep-rooted, shallow-rooted, and try and get as much of that into the system over time as you can, and it'll self-manage. You know, there's a point somewhere where it'll like doing certain things, whereas you might want to force it in another direction. Perhaps just let it have its head for a while. I mean, these things take time to develop, but you know, I think that the key thing is having it covered all the time, and if you're going to do cover crop and you're going to do it annually or you're going to do it semi-annually, then let's not do it with cultivation. There's enough equipment out there now that can do these things without turning the soil over, without losing all that carbon that you're building up. And I think it's about having that thought process that helps make that change. Now, we've done it with really old, crappy gear. We've now got some really nice gear that's going to make it effective, but it doesn't mean you have to have the flashiest gear in the world to get it done. It's about just changing the way you go about it. And I think there's so much tradition in a lot of the wine regions in the country, especially in South Australia, that require it to be done how it's always been done, which is fully tilled every year. And we just know that there's irrefutable data that says that that's a really bad idea, and we need to stop doing it and doing it better. And no-till and that's what I found. You know, the no-till croppers in all over the world are doing it really well and into a whole heap more trash and stuff than we are in vineyards, and they're earning their living out of it, whereas we're just having it in there for something to do a lot of the time, whereas we can do it much better, I think, and that's a good example of what you've got. That's McLaren Vale on the left. That's not helping anyone, least of all the guy that's got the vineyard. And then on the right is a simple cover crop mix. It's not as diverse as Vanya's. It's probably got 8 to 10 species in it, but it's the same rainfall, 25 mils over 24 hours. You could drive a tractor in there if you really wanted to, in my place, and then none of it's gone into where it needs to go. So,
yeah, I remember going to Alsace when you could travel, and there'd been a major rain event the night before, and there was one. It was actually, people say how can they have one row as biodynamic and the next row is not, and one row had been farmed biodynamically and there was no wash away at all, and the next row was a conventionally farmed, and the whole row almost had washed away, and it was really interesting to see just how dramatic those changes are when you manage your soil properly. And I think you're right, Richard. It's you do what you can. First is like to get cover crop in and to keep the ground covered so you don't lose your carbon and all sorts of other things for soil structure.
So we might have broken up with Vanya. So within organic management, there are regulations as to the ground cover that is required.
But extra water holding potential.
Yeah, we've lost her, but I'm sure she'll be coming back shortly. Hayley, you've also got mostly ground cover most of the time on your winery as well. How do you manage this? Because you are also in a drier area.
Yeah, I think where I'd go is I agree with Richard. It's more important to have the cover on the ground. I think the greatest challenge we've actually had is convincing some of our senior powers when they drive past the vineyards that it doesn't look perfectly mown down and neat and row. And I think that some of those beliefs that we have internally, say for us, we're a very busy tourism operation as well as a vineyard. So, we have upwards of 80,000 people coming to visit the winery every year. Some of those internal beliefs can really hold you back on what's possible within your viti space. So for us, having the ground cover and getting it on, it hasn't been a big deal. It's not a challenge. I think it's been managing expectations of the broader team. We have over 200 employees, just making sure that everyone understands why something looks like it does, how it's ended up there, what its purpose is, and giving them a good story to tell the customer, because it's not, sometimes it feels really simple when you're in a small business to be able to just make something happen, and the only people you're convincing is maybe a team of 5. For us, convincing a team of 200 that these practices are worthwhile and that they're beneficial, it just comes with its own challenges. So I guess what I'd say is we don't till between row. We have ground cover across all our vineyards, but the challenge for us is expectations and beliefs that come from people who aren't working in the vineyard space and what they believe should be happening, rather than trusting the team on the ground to be I guess following the right behaviours and doing the right thing and doing what we all agree is, in this room, the way to go. That can sometimes be the biggest inhibitor for our business, is managing other people's expectations in our business.
Yeah, definitely. And given, all the tourists that you have, and Richard, I understand that you've started using livestock to manage some of that as well. How's that going?
Well, very well. It's a really important piece of the puzzle for us, Josefine, because, if we talk about, again, this coming back to this holistic thing, if we're going to do less work, less tractor passes in a vineyard, then we need to manage, the winter biomass that we build up, and right the way through into early spring. That's where it really started. for us. But what we've seen is that livestock management intensively, through rotational cell grazing, so really actively managing them across the landscape rather than just set stocking them over time, has changed plant species diversity in most of the blocks. So we've got sort of dominant, much more dominant grass legume mixes. A lot of the woody weeds that we were finding were an issue. Certainly the summer ones like fat hen and nightshade and a few others have all started to taper back. We haven't got rid of them totally, but we can definitely see a decline because we've got more competition for them. That is less bare ground for them to get established in. And because we're getting a really good mix of grass and legume under vine, some of which we've actively managed, most of which has just come up naturally, means that they don't have the space to come up in summer. We're now not having to do any cultivation in about 30% of the vineyard, which is really encouraging because that is a major cost. A lot of it's done, as Hayley says, to sort of appease the visual aspects of vineyards. Some of it's done for competition, but I'm a great believer in that if we can, as Vanya's done, drive soil carbon levels up, we've got to remember that it's the great production centre for most really productive soils is good soil carbon levels because they hold nutrient, they cycle nutrient, they've got good microbial activities. So we shouldn't be afraid of having plants covering things and adding competition because I think there's a symbiosis there eventually that will occur where we're making the soil much more productive by having plants on it than we are by removing them from it. And I think that's a really hard concept for people to get across. And I'm not saying that I've fully embraced it. I'm still struggling with that concept to a degree. But the more I've seen over the last 2 years in that space, the more confident I am that that we'll get there. So the livestock piece is hugely important for us for driving down tractor passes, for increasing, for cycling nutrient, intensively. And for changing the plant landscape to give us a much better range of plants during the summer period and spring period than we've had previously. But they've got to be managed really actively, and I think that's where, as an industry, we've got to get better at that because generally they're not managed as well as they could be.
We've tried just about everything. We had sheep, we've had chickens. But what happened was they all prefer the nice grasses and leave the weeds, i.e. the kikuyu and the cape weed, behind. So for us, when we had sort of livestock on our property, it was a disaster. So we went back to doing the cultivation, the mid-row planting to compete with the outcompete with the kikuyu grass and also the cape weed. So we've kept on with that style of management, and we find we have a lot of birds, in the vineyard. A lot of crows and magpies and dare I say it, silver eyes at this time of year are starting to come back because we did have a really nice blossom and that kept them all away from the grapes. But I think that's the thing. Everyone has to find their own management style in a way that works in their region, because certainly for us, we tried cattle and sheep, and the chickens all got eaten by the foxes. So it was we had geese at one stage too. But I know a lot of people there's some people in Margaret River, very small property at Burnside Organic Farm. They manage their kikuyu successfully with geese. They just have to keep the foxes out by putting a fence around it, a fox-proof fence. So there's always a solution, I think, in that way. And it's always makes my heart feel good when I feel people have good livestock solutions on their properties and their vineyards. But for us, it didn't work.
Yeah, I agree to certainly, Vanya. I mean, it's been a bit of trial and error. We've been at it for about 10 years. Again, we started with cattle, but then with sheep, and really the breakthrough came when we started reducing the area in which they were in, so increasing the animal intensity per hectare and increasing the rotation. So rather than having a 20 hectare plot split in two, for example, and just sort of wandering backwards and forwards, having it split into 7 or 8 or 9 paddocks, depending on how you can do it easily. and it cost effectively. But then rotating them through 2 to 3 times, maybe even 4 times during the season, that's where we started to see some, control of some of those problem weeds, but also the change in plant species on the ground, because they were having to eat the bad stuff in the end, the stuff they didn't want to eat because there was just no choice, and that allowed the other stuff to come back. So we're still having a few challenges with Paspalum. For us is a bit of a pain, but the kikuyu, the other sort of nasty summer grasses, luckily we're not as sandy as that's where you are, and we don't have that as an issue. But we've still got a bit of stuff we've got to work on, but we like what we're seeing.
Yeah, interesting. No, that's great. Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? Try and see.
Yeah, but it's not all bad. I guess the only good thing with increased carbon dioxide is for the vines. So this will lead to faster plant growth if we ignore potential acidification or a whole lot of other potential negatives. But ultimately, more extreme weather events is one of the very negative things about climate change. And do you guys insure your vines, or at this point in time?
We're trying to. Yeah. We're looking at that now. No, we're looking at the whole process of insuring our vines at the moment, but it's quite tricky, just because obviously insurance premiums have gone up. So,
yeah,
can you insure against climate change? Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the best way around it is to try and, mitigate it as much as you can. I don't know. I have a different outlook in that respect. I think, if you're, there's some really amazing, there was this professor called Professor Tom Lyons, who did this research on, and he has showed this photograph, which you probably all seen similar photographs of a fence where, the going all the way down the West Australian agricultural areas where there was all, the trees were removed on one side and there was bare land on the other. And the other side of the fence, there was bush, and all down that bush, there were the cloud band, so the trees attracting the rain. And I think, there's things like that really we know so little about. So I suppose I'd rather come from that point of view than insuring against something where we don't know how fast it's going to go. It's a matter of what time, how, in small business, how much energy and time you've got to put into different things, Yeah, I don't know what the others are doing, but they probably have
I think we take a very similar approach, Vanya. I mean, we insure, but really we're just insuring for frost is probably the only climate risk that we're insuring for at the moment, because your premiums can go pretty high when you're trying to look at all the different risks that your vineyard or your winery might experience. For us, our greatest risk and greatest premium at the moment is actually in our winery itself, with some of the ways that tank insulation is set up, which is just astronomically ridiculous what those premiums are at the moment. But
absolutely,
it's crazy. But from a vineyard perspective, I guess all I could share is, so we have 1,200 hectares of vines, and we have around just over 160 hectares of revegetation on the property. We've also got a lot of water that flows through and around our property, so we're very fortunate. What we notice is that we're 3 degrees cooler than anywhere else, just purely because of the natural landscape that we've invested in, but is also naturally part of our site. So I guess the way we look at it is it's really important to create that environment where grapes can grow really effectively. And if you can create a microclimate where you're protecting yourself from some of those extreme weather events. So we just noticed that our hot days are not as hot days for people who are 3 kilometres away. We've just got less variability because of the nature of the way that our site is, with a lot of water and a lot of trees in the ground. It helps us a lot. Not that the insurance companies care about that at all, but we care.
That's right. They don't. It's just extraordinary. It's like, oh gosh. It's
Yeah, and I mean, if we're talking about your farm, Haley, or vineyard rather, this is a photo of your solar panels, and that, I mean, that has been a huge part of what you do. But I mean, we would want every roof to be covered with a solar panel if possible. But what are the limitations of something like that?
Oh, look, so our energy footprint is like very big. I will say that now. It's way bigger for us than our transportation, and way bigger than our glass footprint. So it's about 60% of our total footprint is energy consumption, because of the nature of our business, which involves a lot of bottling, so high intensive energy use. We do actually now have 2 more of those roofs covered, so we're probably up to around 3/4 of our total energy footprint has solar. Some of the challenges, I think, if someone's looking into solar, these are just some of the challenges we experience, is finding a provider who has onshore support post installation. So finding someone who, if you have solar panels have inverters. One of the biggest challenges once you've got your solar up is maintaining the infrastructure that you've established. And I think one thing that we've learned is that it's really important to look at the post-installation care when you're going down the path of putting on solar, particularly at scale. So that is definitely one thing that we've learned about solar. I think also just ancillary costs, depending on your site. There can be some cost involved with trenching cables to be able to hook it all up together to make it really effective. I'm talking purely from a winery perspective. Having solar pumps and all of those sorts of things, much more attainable, very reliable, very easy. But for managing a footprint of our scale from an energy perspective with solar, they're some of the things that we've learned along the way. Is things to look out for and investigate before you go ahead.
And Richard, you also have quite a large solar system on site as well, correct?
Yes, we do, Josephine. I mean, that's fairly new to us, but again, that came out of the first audit. That was obviously, and we were probably, I don't know about everyone. Maybe it's just me. I found the whole solar thing quite confusing over time, and we were sort of waiting until it got to a point where it was much more understandable and there wasn't quite so much movement in markets and what you needed to do and things. So it offsets all our irrigation now. The trade-off is that obviously the best time to do that is when the sun's shining, so we're having the water a little bit more during the day than perhaps I would like. So there's a bit of there's a little bit of evaporation trade-off there, but it's made a huge difference in terms of our that was our biggest power usage in the vineyard by a long way, and that's basically reduced it to zero, which has been fantastic. But yeah, like Haley said, it's not without it's not a panacea, but it certainly improved the situation long term. And then we've been able to then, because of that, add a bottled wine storage shed site that we wouldn't have thought about before, because we can now call that totally offset it with some solar panels because of the shed size. So it's opened up some possibilities for us that we wouldn't have looked at 5 years ago, which has been good.
One thing I will say about solar is that all of the subsidies that are currently there come off in 2030. So if you want to get solar on, if you don't have it on, I'd be recommending you do it soon, so you can take advantage of. So there's 2 offsets: the small scale renewable energy offset or the large scale renewable energy offset. The small scale, you get an upfront deduction on the total capital cost of your solar investment, which is really awesome. If you want to do under 100 kilowatts of solar, it's a really great way to get it on at the moment at a more cost-effective price. If you're going over 100 kilowatts, they have a program called the Large Scale Renewable Energy Offsets Program, and that's not an upfront deduction, but essentially you'll get paid for the solar that you generate back into the grid up until the year 2030. So you've still got, what's that, 8 years to go. But the plan is at that stage, the government will take off all subsidies. I don't know if they'll be renewed, but just something for people to consider if they don't have solar on yet.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, government subsidies are such a big part of most environmental things at the moment. So they've just changed the tax for the Australian carbon credit units. They've also changed it so that you can, renegotiate any carbon credits, but you don't sell your carbon credits, Richard. And I found that was quite interesting. Why is that?
I'm in Vanya's wheelhouse here. I mean, I want to be where she is. We want to be able to generate what we currently offset on site, and I'm quite sure we can. We've just got to get the measurement and the metrics around that correct. I don't see, and I think this is a big trap. This is a personal opinion, a big trap for producers down the track. This whole monetizing carbon. The Wilmont scheme is very, is quite public, and the grazing, these large scale grazing operations are probably much better suited to it. But I think intensive horticulture systems that are by nature high energy use and output systems, I think we're going to need to have this carbon in our own hands to be able to offset because eventually somewhere along the track we're going to need to be able to do it, because the community is going to require us to do it, or whether export. I mean, even some of the export markets now require you to pay for the amount of carbon you've used to get a product to their site. So I think we don't see that as something that will add to our bottom line, but more means that we don't have to be in the carbon market, because one of the things we have seen in the last 12 months because of these big sales is that the price has increased by 30 to 40% just in the last 12 months. So that's just adding money to the bottom line for us. It's about $100 a tonne to offset our current emissions. We'd like to be like Vanya and do it in-house. So we're going to put, rather than paying my insurance company to insure my stuff, I'm going to put that money into measurement and doing those sort of things in-house so that we can cover our costs. So I think horticulture is going to be much different to large land holdings of broadacre grazing and other systems, because we just don't have the land mass to produce the amount that we can then sell. But we could, with really good land management, offset our own stuff in-house, and that's where we're looking down the track.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I just would like to say also that we have a we had about $100,000 worth of carbon credits in our soil, but we didn't do what we did because of to get money, So it was something that we now have registered the first vineyard carbon farming project in Western Australia, and I think it's been quite a very complicated journey. I mean, it's been 2 years to get to that point, 2 or 3 years really, of everything changing all the time. And to answer your question, Josefine, as to why aren't people doing that? Well, it's very complicated, and I think there's still a lot going on in terms of the government changing everything all the time to get to that point where you can. But we are at that point now, and we have registered a 25-year carbon project. We will check the soils it's all long term, it's going to be at least 3 to 5 years before we can test the soils to see whether we get any carbon credits. In that time, the carbon price has gone from $16 up to $64, and now it's gone back down again. So I think it's a very very untested, unknown market with a lot of potential that everybody's just jumping on. People are doing farming. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't doing organic farming, but a lot of people are, just getting their properties all set up for, farming carbon very fast and very quickly with huge acreages and huge amount of money. So I think, you're best to stick to where you're heading and why you're doing it. And if carbon farming is an outcome of that, that's a really great benefit for those people who have done the right thing by the land. And I think, Australia is a huge landmass, and we have a huge amount of country that we could realise that. And I just had assumed it would all be with organics, but I think it's probably not going to be like that. But it is hugely satisfying to think that you could possibly make some money from doing the right thing by the land and farming carbon in the soil. But there's far more money to be made in tree farming, but that also is only while the trees are growing that you have that benefit. So Yeah, I'm a great believer in soil farming as a way to, carbon farming to rehabilitate the land. But there's a few people that don't think it's such a good way to do that. But I really think it's a good thing when you eventually get to that point. But it's a lot of work to get there, and it's a lot of, when you're a small producer, is a lot of work to actually. We have Carbon West, who are a company that are doing that all for us. And doing the measurements, and they're an independent auditor and all those sorts of things in terms of how we're doing it, how we're getting their results. They're all completely accredited on a national basis, but it certainly does take a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of energy, but it's worth it in the end. Yeah. So the carbon farming project we've started beginning of this year. We looked at getting a government grant, which we're still negotiating, as it's only a loan, and there's a lot of conditions in that make it quite onerous on us as a small business. But yeah, I think it's great seeing things actually moving because it's happening now. But it's been a complicated process which has been evolving the whole time, very, very quickly.
And Hayley, how much does it cost to bring your business to becoming carbon neutral? What cost has that been to the business as such?
I guess the way that our carbon auditing works, well, it's hard to quantify the cost, I guess, to maintain that beautiful landscape that you see on your screen. Obviously, we've got a lot of wetlands and a lot of natural biodiversity and wildlife on the property, and so we need to look after it a lot and sort of have that nice bridge between nature and humans, because we do have lots of humans wandering around as well. For our audit, we do, it's usually 25,000 on an on year, and then it's probably half the cost on an off year. We have been working away for over a decade to be able to naturally balance our footprint. So exactly what Richard's aiming for, exactly what Vanya's achieved. We're hoping to be carbon positive by the end of next year, but that's through a different methodology that Vanya's gone down with soil carbon. So for us, we go to the open market to buy credits for around 150 tonnes of our footprint. Our total footprint's around 2,700 tonnes. So we're pretty close to being able to naturally balance. So a lot of our time, or a lot of our cost, I guess, is in the auditing process. And then really it's just managing like the diversity of our landscape on the ground on a daily basis, which is, it's more just people, managing people who invest in looking after the land. That's where the other cost is. But it's not, for us, it's a positive, as in it's a profitable, positive experience. We don't view it as a cost, we view it as an investment. And we think our return on investment each year, what we spend compared to what we get back, is probably 2.5 to sort of 3.5 times. So the cost doesn't really factor into it for us. We look at it more as an investment, as Vanya said, for future generations, and also for the Tamarong people. We do a lot of work with our local Indigenous association, and they help a lot. So I would encourage everyone not to be fearful of that, and reach out to your local Indigenous association and get them involved in your property. We've found it to be a really positive experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's not just the potential carbon offsets. It's, if you look at this, the 1% increase in soil organic matter, the increased water holding capacity, and the same for soil carbon. So I think that organic agriculture, any form of agriculture, has a huge step to play within this, and it's amazing to hear stories from Vanya, Richard and Hayley about the amazing things that you are doing on your farms to help move towards mitigating climate change through your production systems, or at least completely offsetting it, which is really impressive when I, as a consumer, can buy a product that is carbon positive, carbon neutral, and has this environmental stewardship. So really well done to you, all of you today. Were there any questions from the public before? We've run a little bit over on time today. So if there were any questions to Vanya, Hayley or Richard, please send them through now. Otherwise, we can always follow that up at a later date. I hope that, if you're producers here, I invite you to question your current production systems. Today and throughout this webinar series, is your production system as resilient as possible? What are some of the smaller changes that you can do to improve your current system? And what will you do with the information and that you've learned here today from Hayley, Richard and Vanya? So there's definitely something to be said from the consumer things. I think as you guys have pointed out, at this point in time, you as the producers are definitely shouldering most of those emissions, and there will definitely be a chance for that in September when we have our consumer focused emission of the series. And if there weren't any further questions, I want to thank Hayley, Richard and Vanya so much for your time today and insight into climate change and carbon emissions. And thank you again. We've got this will all be emailed out to everybody who's subscribed, and thank you very much again, and I hope you have an excellent afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us for this Australian Organic Limited emission.
Thanks very much, Josephine. Thanks, Hayley. Thanks, Richard. Bye.
Thanks, Josephine.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.